I wish my task was to help raise 10 billion US dollars. It's actually 100. So we have quite a tall order. As most of you in this room would know, when President Ramaphosa, in his State of the Nation address and in subsequent announcements, made investment a core part of his economic program. And one of the ambitions is to raise 100 billion US dollars in investment over the next 5 years, both local and international. So yes, I don't know if that makes our task easier, but of course it starts with revitalizing the fundamentals of the economy so that we can make a compelling investment case for South Africa. But today I'm actually going to step back a bit from the investment angle to talk more around a subject that I've worked on for many years, competition regulation. As Joanne mentioned, I was at the Competition Commission. I joined there as an economist. And even later in my own practice, one of the focus areas was competition policy. So I'm going to talk about the evolution of competition policy in South Africa, what the aims are, what our experience has been with a new competition regulation regime since 1994, and also future developments. Obviously, I think competition policy is a very important area of study, partly because, you would have seen in many diagnostics of what is wrong with the South African economy, the lack of, or rather, let's say concentration, economic concentration is often cited as a problem. As a problem in of itself, but also as a barrier to further development in the economy because of the limited competitive dynamism, which then translates into high barriers of entry, which translates into poor export performance, and many other maladies that you see. So, to think about the historical context of competition regulation in South Africa, there's always been competition, or not always, the apartheid government had a competition regulation regime also aimed at the traditional aims of competition policy. So if we go really back in time and we think about 19th century United States, which is where really where competition policy became formalized. You had a new colony forming in the United States and a new economy developing, which in those early days was seen as dominated by major powers, major economic houses, the Gerties, the Mellons, quite a few dynasties that were the main drivers of economic and industrial development, the trusts, as they were called in the United States. And so there was a policy move to bust the trust. And so the field of antitrust was formed. The idea being that you want to have an economy that's competitive, and the Standard Oils and the Railway Trust and the Telecommunication Trust and all of those big conglomerates were stifling the development of the economy. It was phrased actually in developmental terms. It's preventing prices from going down. It's preventing new entrants from entering the American economy. And so antitrust was born. The same across the Atlantic, around the same time in Europe, there was also a move towards competition regulation. So South Africa also adopted the general trend in industrial policy that says that we want to have free and open markets, but if you let private interests to propagate on their own, what you often end up with is concentration and the creation of monopoly. And so you actually have to have an active policy to act against monopoly. So we had legislation in South Africa which had the same stated aims, but was not seen as very effective. And so 1994 happened, And one of the great imperatives of the new regime was to open up the economy. And competition policy was one of those tools, in this case, to review apartheid competition policy and to bring it up to speed with modern competition policy. In the apartheid era, competition policy was often very much negotiated. You know, if there was a problem in a market, the government would call people to sit together, think about a solution. If there were mergers, they were also very discussed, and deals were cut. So, for instance, in the beer industry, a market structure emerged where the wine and distilling interests were put in one conglomerate and the beer interests were put into another conglomerate. And it was a negotiated kind of arrangement. Whereas with post-apartheid competition policy, the idea was to have a more activist policy that actually challenges market power. So you had the act that was promulgated in 1998, the Competition Act, which is the main overarching legislative framework that governs competition policy. So what were some of the aims of competition policy? If you look at the preamble of the Act, it's actually very broad-ranging. To have open, free, fair, efficient markets, to help South African companies compete globally, to ensure that historically disadvantaged and small and medium enterprises are able to participate in the economy. So a very ambitious program of opening up the economy and ensuring that there's competition, and we'll go into detail into some of the instruments of that policy. The legislation gave birth to the Competition Commission, Competition Appeal Court, and the Competition Tribunal. In 2009, there were some amendments to give it more teeth, to make sure that, for instance, if somebody is engaged in a cartel, they don't only face financial penalties, but also criminal penalties. But that we'll also get into in more detail now. And last year, there were further amendments that were to ensure that competition policy is still going to achieve the deconcentration mission that it has been tasked with. Now, where does competition policy fit in with industrial policy? How does it, are they in conflict, or are they complementary matters? Now, if you think about the South African economy that we've just described, which was dominated by a few sectors to begin with, the mining value chain, financial services, a little bit of manufacturing, and in each of those sectors you have conglomerates that are dominant. At the same time, you want to develop an industrial base, especially as a post-apartheid government. So the question becomes, does competition policy hinder the industrial policy agenda in general, or does it not? Competition policy tries to encourage as much rivalry and competition as possible, as much entry as possible, and kind of frowns against dominance. Not dominance in of itself, but where that dominance is seen to be abused. On the other hand, in trying to build your industrial base, you probably want to have big corporates and big entities, big industrial companies that employ a lot of people, that are able to expend resources in innovation, that are able to invest. You know, if we're talking, for instance, about $100 billion investment target, it's not going to be small and medium enterprises that are going to contribute significantly to that. You need your Sasols and your ArcelorMittals and your telecoms and the big companies to invest. So there's that tension that's often put forward between industrial policy and competition policy. But on the other hand, if you think about the inverse, if you do want to have a dynamic economy with investment, with export competitiveness, you want companies that are used to competition in their local market, that are not used to the quiet life of the monopolist, as Adam Smith described it. So there's also that side of the argument to say that actually what you need is as much competition as possible, and your barriers to entry in markets to be as low as possible, so that your companies are dynamic and competitive, and are able to hold their own against companies from the rest of the world. So this is the tension that the post-apartheid government inherited. And so in terms of its policy instruments, it decided that actually we are going to go for an activist competition policy that encourages open markets. At the same time, we're going to go for re-industrialization and try to recover the industrial base that we've lost, especially in an economy where you need significant employment growth, but there's a bias towards capital-intensive industry. And therefore, you do need your small and medium enterprises to be active. And indeed, if you look at the National Development Plan, you need your SMMEs to be the major generators of employment. So this is a tension that competition policy has had to navigate in tension to some of the counter-arguments that would say we actually want national champions. Now, just to illustrate how that challenge plays out in practice, early on, after the 1998 legislation was passed, there were constant complaints in the steel industry to say, obviously, steel is the basis of industrialization in many respects. That's the key input that you want in your production. But there was the constant argument that the dominant provider of steel products that go into manufacturing, ArcelorMittal, which had become privatized and which controlled 90% of the market, was charging prices that were excessive. In other words, it was abusing its monopoly. Not only that it was abusing its monopoly, but that it had actually been the beneficiary of industrial policy in the past. It had had access to cheap iron ore. It had had significant investment from the apartheid government. Not so long ago, we used to have cheap electricity. So here's a beneficiary of industrial policy, which is not translating that benefit into a robust manufacturing sector, but it's actually capturing those profits and those rents and is charging downstream manufacturers prices that don't reflect its cost advantages, and also prices that make South African manufacturers uncompetitive relative to international competitors. And so, the DTI advocated on this until the Competition Commission took it up into an investigation of abuse of dominance against ArcelorMittal. Very complicated case, because then the question becomes, what is an excessive price? How do you determine that a price is excessive? The Competition Act simply makes it illegal, prohibited to charge an excessive price. And then it says that an excessive price is one that has no relation to economic value. So then the question is, what is the economic value of that good or service in question? And so this is obviously a very, that it requires detailed economic analysis, often in terms of profitability studies, to understand, does this company earn supernormal profits? Is it in line with its peers? Is the differential between cost and price such that one can say that it's unjustified or bears no relation to economic value? So you can imagine economists at the Commission and on the other side had lots of fun for many years establishing and fighting this case. At the initial instance, the case was actually brought to the Commission by the mining industry, two gold mining companies who were consumers of steel products. And in the first instance, the tribunal found that there had been excessive pricing. But then at the appeal court, that was overturned because it was felt that the tests that had been conducted to establish the excessiveness of the price were not in accordance with best practice, so to speak. So on and on it went until there was a private settlement, not long ago, maybe 5 years ago, where the parties actually just sat around the table, DTI, the Commission, ArcelorMittal, and they came up with a dispensation of how pricing is going to be done in a way that is seen as competitive and supportive of manufacturing and economic growth. A similar story, interestingly, with Sasol. In the chemical business, inputs into plastic. Now, if you look at the figures in the South African plastics industry, plastics manufacturing buckets, those sorts of products, there is a steep decline in production and a steep decline in employment over time, and this has been placed solely at the feet of the input producer Sasol to say that the prices that they charge to local manufacturers were excessive. The argument made that for a producer in China buying inputs from Sasol, they would pay less than it would take for a producer in Germiston or in Isando or in any of our industrial areas buying the same products from Sasol because of its pricing practices. So once again, an excessive pricing case. In this case, it was established that the price that Sasol was charging was excessive, especially given the historical benefits that it had enjoyed. The same history of state subsidies, etc., which meant that its cost of production is quite low, but it was charging local manufacturers what they would buy on the international market, and even more than international market because they were also charged notional transport costs, even though they didn't incur any transport costs to receive that material. And here the Competition Appeal Court stated that it did not think that history was relevant to current pricing. So that one, there hasn't been a settlement, but the local downstream industries continue to complain that the materials that they receive are priced excessively. So you'd have gathered from the examples that I've given, in essence, how it works, is that somebody would complain of an abuse of dominance or a cartel, or something that has gone wrong in the market that they feel that is a competition issue, and the Competition Commission would be, at the first instance, the institution that investigates the matter. Once that is done, in most matters, the Commission either has, or in limited instances, the Commission would have a final say, but in most instances, it would be a recommendation to the tribunal where the other side can also put forward their views. And once again, a lot of economic argument on both sides to establish the truth. And if that doesn't exhaust the matter or resolve the matter, or one party is unhappy, they can take it to the Competition Appeal Court. And if that doesn't resolve it, they can go all the way to the Constitutional Court. So competition regulation is an interesting mix between the law and the economics of it. And you always have to make both cases. You have to ensure that you have a complaint or an issue that is adjudicated according to what the law and the legal requirements are, but the substance and the content of the argument would obviously be a lot of economic evidence with economists on both sides either establishing the case or not. So the main sort of categories of issues that are dealt with are complaints in terms of abuse of dominance, cartels, excessive pricing, price discrimination. They're all listed out in the Competition Act. The other avenue of activity is looking at mergers and acquisitions where companies are getting together and they are above a certain size, then they would have to notify to the Commission that they intend to merge, and the Commission would have to establish whether the merger is in line with competition or is going to have anti-competitive effects or not. So I'm sure this audience can appreciate this example. A few years ago, there was a proposed merger between Juta and Van Skyke. I don't know how you'd feel about that. But it was prohibited because it was projected that it would have the effect of raising the price of textbooks because at least at the time, online shopping was not quite established, and those were really the two suppliers of textbooks in the South African market, and if they merged, there simply would be no competition. So I think in recent times, there have been some high-profile merger and acquisition transactions that have played out in the media, like Massmart and Walmart, more recently AB InBev taking over SAB Miller. But the principal question there is always, in this transaction before us, what are going to be the impacts on competition? So what are the impacts on prices, on quality, on outcomes for consumers that we project using various models, surveys, studies? What is the market impact of this transaction, and is it going to be to the detriment of consumers? Obviously, if the answer is yes, then the merger is prohibited, and then people can go through that whole process of disputing it at the tribunal or appeal court all the way to constitutional court. But in most instances, by the appeal court, most parties would accept the outcome. If it's not detrimental to competition, there's also a second assessment as to whether it's in the public interest. And the legislation goes through various criteria as to what is in the public interest or not, or rather there are four areas in which you assess whether a transaction would be to the detriment of the public interest or not. Most of them around employment, industrial development, black economic empowerment. So the example that I just mentioned around Walmart and Massmart, as you can imagine, Massmart was probably number 4 or 5 in terms of market share when it came to retail, so not quite a giant, not a giant at all. Very competitive retail market. Walmart was not in the country at all at the time, so there's no concentration of economic power. And so on competition grounds, there really were no issues. In fact, you could see how having an international player might actually boost Massmart to be more competitive to the likes of ShopRite, Pick n Pay, enter new markets as they had planned, etc. So possibly pro-competitive, and there were no objections raised on that angle. On the other hand, on the public interest, there was an uproar because of what was seen as Walmart's practices, especially when it comes to sourcing their products, that they would come into South Africa and they would flood the market with with imported products to the detriment of locally produced manufacturers, because globally their strategy is to source from the cheapest location and sell into their markets. They're probably the second largest employer. Actually, they're the largest employer, private sector employer, but not as big as the NHS in the UK. So significant market power, significant company that controls many value chains. Countless studies were done in the US. When a Walmart enters a particular region, prices are shown to fall. At the same time, employment also declines. So the unions and other NGOs were very exercised by this transaction to say Walmart should not come into South Africa and subject us to this. There wasn't much of a consumer lobby on the other side to say, well, we want cheap prices. It was mostly those arguing for the industrial base and for jobs to be protected. And so the transaction made it through the system and came through with conditions which were imposed. The conditions being that they had to reverse some retrenchments they had made earlier, because those retrenchments were seen as Massmart preparing itself for Walmart, so they were part of the transaction. They had to also ensure that there's a local supplier development fund to make sure that they don't do what everyone fears, that they would displace local suppliers and rely on imports only or predominantly. So that fund, I mean, that was 5 years ago. There have been some interesting success stories of companies that have actually arisen and become major players in the Massmart supply chain as a result of having been beneficiaries of that fund. Doesn't address the bigger question of import penetration in the country, of course, because ShopRite is doing whatever they want and Pick and Pay, etc. Merger regulation or competition regulation is always about the people in front of you and the transaction in front of you, but then you probably need a bigger policy response for the rest of the industry. And I don't think, I mean, we have localization policy, but I'm not sure how effective that is. So in terms of the amendments that were suggested last year and that are still being subject to deliberation, there's a provision to say that instead of just looking at the transaction before you, you should also assess the past few transactions that the company has entered into, because you might not catch that, or you might see a small transaction in front of you, but not catch that it's a part of a bigger creeping transaction that is causing concentration in the market. So the example that's often given is in hospitals. That over time, one hospital group would acquire a hospital here, a hospital there. Each transaction looks like this company acquiring one hospital. You're never going to find that to be anti-competitive or to be a significant concentration. But if you consider what that hospital group has been doing over, say, a 3-year period, you'll see that actually they acquired 20 hospitals. We might be having an issue of building market power here. So there are proposals that merger assessments should consider the transactions that the companies in front of the commission at that particular time have engaged in over the past 3 years, and also to consider cross-shareholdings and cross-directorships that arise out of that transaction, because that could also suggest that there's market power being exercised by directors in one company, also having a stake in another company in that market and acquiring a company, so they're consolidating their power in that way. Now, cartels have been the more prominent area of competition regulation. I'm sure many of you would have read about the bread cartel, the construction cartel, etc., where companies get together and explicitly fix prices or fix some trading condition that obviously hurts consumers. So either ensuring that prices remain at a high level, but often related to that, ensuring that no entrants enter into the market. So also developing strategies to attack collectively any entrants that get into the market. There have been some successful prosecutions of cartels, and I think most business people in South Africa now would be aware, certainly, of this aspect of competition regulation and would stay clear from any practices that are seen as collusive. The main penalty so far has been fines. So maximum turnover of maximum 10% of turnover can be imposed on companies found to have been in a cartel. And some of these have been significant fines, but in general, I think they're never seen as significant enough. And so part of the 2009 set of amendments was to make it a criminal offense for somebody to knowingly cause a company to enter into a cartel. It's been a long time of processing the changes, so no one has gone to jail yet, but yeah. It's certainly, at least in theory, on the books, there are criminal sanctions for people engaged in cartels. I think, one of the most egregious ones, well, the bread cartel was particularly egregious, and the construction cartel, and I think those were two areas where people really wanted to see harsh penalties. But I think going forward, that will come to bear. The issues there are more administrative. You have a bunch of economists and lawyers, sitting at the competition regulators, and they're not criminal prosecutors. So you have to get the criminal prosecutors into the system to ensure that you can have that aspect being taken forward. Because literally now it would just mean going to a police station and reporting a cartel. The institutions are just not set up for that just yet. The fines are paid to the national budget, so that has also often been a criticism that it doesn't go to people harmed directly by the cartel. There have been some instances, like in the bread cartel, where the authorities tried to come up with innovative solutions to boost that value chain, either to boost entrance, have a development fund for new players in that market, or have a period of price moderation or price reductions to try and more directly address the harm that has been caused. Of course, on the other side of the argument would be that you don't need to do that. You can collect the fine, put it in the revenue fund, and it goes to the public as a whole, and that's how you find your reparation. But that's an ongoing argument. But increasingly, you find that the authorities try to think of imposing penalties that directly address the harm that has been caused. Abuse of dominance I touched on earlier. So abuse of dominance as distinct from cartels, because cartels is straightforward. You fix something, there's usually hard evidence of that. Abuse of dominance is more the metal steels, the Sasols, where it's the practice that has come into question to say that it is exerting market power in a way that harms consumers. Since '98, there have been 14 cases that have been assessed on their merits. 8 were dismissed, 5 were successful. So a very difficult area of investigation. 1 successful at the competition tribunal, but overturned at the appeal court. So the ones that have been successful so far were 2 against South African Airways for excluding entrants into the market, particularly pricing in a predatory way, and also inducing travel agents to sell only SAA tickets, which had harm against the likes of Nationwide Airlines, Comair. But all the airlines that have exited that market would claim it's because of SAA. Then there was 1 against Telkom for abuse of dominance that hurt value-added service providers, especially internet service providers. And 2 in agriculture, 1 against Patency for price discrimination, and Senves also for not a price discrimination but a margin squeeze, where they were seen to push out traders in the market who also depended on them for storage. So the basic point here is that, you know, for competition regulation, it's been very difficult to look at the conduct of a company and say that this is an abuse of dominance. It's very easy to establish that a company is dominant, it has so much market share, very easy to characterize that this is how it prices, but very difficult to say that that is actually an abuse, and to establish that in terms of economic fact. So, as you can imagine, the legal side of the fraternity has come up with a whole set of proposed amendments to try to make it easier to deal with dominance. So changing some of the language in the Act to make it clearer. You know, just saying something has no relation to economic value probably doesn't help anyone. So making it a far more concrete, coming up with cost standards for predation, thinking about how to explicitly set out what constitutes abusive behavior, and also just making it more deterrent, so by imposing penalties for first offenses, which hasn't been the case so far, to just prevent the behavior from beginning in the first place. A powerful tool that came with the 2009 amendments was the power of the authorities to conduct market inquiries. So this week, the healthcare market inquiry team issued its recommendations for how to reform and to improve competition in the healthcare market. And the idea behind a market inquiry is that actually it is very difficult to try and prosecute a particular firm for certain kinds of behavior. Rather step back and think about the market as a whole and say, if we investigate this market and if we look at this set of firms and set of practices, what are the things that are distorting competition? What are the things that are making it difficult for entrants to participate in the market? What are the government policies that support concentration? For instance, in airlines, people have argued consistently that it's not that they're bad people at SAA, but consistently giving them subsidies distorts the market. So it becomes less of an abuse of dominance case as more understanding what are the rules of the game that make it difficult for competition to emerge. So that's the idea behind market inquiries. This particular amendment came into effect in 2013. And since then, there have been inquiries into private healthcare. So that's just been complete. Well, it's not completed. The findings are out for public comment. There's been one into public transport, grocery retail, mobile data in response to data must fall, and one into LPG. And in that instance, then once again, economists would look at a particular market and then make recommendations to say that in healthcare, I haven't looked at the healthcare inquiry findings in detail, but I assume that the kinds of things they would say would be that certain prices should be regulated, certain licensing provisions should be relaxed to allow greater entry. We should probably make it easier for hospitals to employ international skills. So those kinds of almost indirect things that would mean that the private healthcare market becomes more competitive, and also would mean that if there is any market power in any aspect of that industry, it's either subject to direct regulation or it's challenged by the possibility of entry by competitors. And so that has been kind of the future of competition regulation in many instances, to say that, of course, it's important to prosecute cartels, it's important to scrutinize mergers. At the same time, it's important to look at the market as a whole, so that when you have remedies, those remedies are not just for the specific companies that you're looking at in the example I gave with Massmart and Walmart, but that you could look at grocery retail as a whole and say, this is how we're going to enhance competition in this market. So for grocery retail, for instance, some people are advocating that practice where in a shopping mall you can only have one or two anchor tenants of a particular type of retail, that should be relaxed, so that if I'm running a shopping mall, I don't have an exclusive arrangement with Pick and Pay only, as is the practice now, but that I can allow any butcher, any baker, any retailer to also come into that space and compete and make that standard across the industry. So that's the kind of thinking around thinking about how do you make competition policy more effective, and I suppose also less adversarial on some level, to ensure that actually you have the industry around the table and you start thinking about pro-competitive tools, but doing it in a transparent manner, because we don't want to go back to that situation with pre-apartheid competition policy where there are lots of deals and agreements that are not open to scrutiny. Rather have public participation, as you see with these inquiries, where people can then make presentations around how they think competition should be enhanced in a particular market. I think I'll leave it there, and we'll probably delve into some of the issues more in the Q&A session. Thank you.